This was the moment that set in motion what would become one of the biggest heartbreaks in St. Louis sports history. In 1988, the St. Louis Cardinals football team left for Phoenix, leaving behind an empty stadium in a city without Sunday football. The move didn't happen overnight. For years, team owner Bill Bidwill had complained about poor attendance and the lack of a modern stadium. The Cardinals played in Busch Stadium, which was built for baseball and offered little of the revenue potential that newer NFL venues provided. When negotiations for a new football stadium stalled and local support began to fade, Bidwill accepted an offer from Arizona.
We applied to the National Football League today to transfer the Cardinals franchise to Phoenix, Arizona.
The decision had been rumored for months, but when it finally happened, it still hit the city hard. Overnight, St. Louis went from being an NFL city to a football ghost town. The fans who had followed the team for decades were left with nothing but memories. St. Louis response. But St. Louis refused to move on quietly. Within weeks of the Cardinals' departure, city and state officials began meeting behind closed doors to plan a comeback. The mayor's office, local business leaders, and the Missouri Department of Economic Development all agreed on one thing: St. Louis could not afford to lose its place in the NFL. Determined to bring football back, they formed a joint committee led by city officials and private investors to explore how St. Louis could make itself attractive to the league again. Their conclusion was bold. The city needed a new stadium, modern, enclosed, and centrally located. It would be the centerpiece of a broader downtown revival, a way to prove St. Louis was still a major league city. By 1989, the plan for a domed stadium downtown had taken shape. The proposal immediately divided opinion. Supporters argued it would revitalize the city and attract major conventions, concerts, and professional sports. Critics called it a financial gamble, warning that taxpayers would shoulder the risk if no team came. Building the dream. Then came the moment of truth. The construction finally began. In 1990, work officially started on the long-promised dome. The foundation stretched across several city blocks, with local contractors and union crews working around the clock to bring the city's vision to life. 2 years or later, in the 1992, the upgraded teal band EMs were raised. For the first time since losing the Cardinals, fans could look downtown and see proof that football might one day return. The new dome was designed as a multi-purpose venue, large enough to host NFL games, yet versatile enough for conventions, concerts, and national events. Meanwhile, city officials made a determined push to secure an NFL expansion franchise. They unveiled the team's concept and name, the St. Louis Stallions. Ownership groups were assembled, branding was complete. The first setback happened when the NFL announced its choices for expansion. In 1993, after years of planning and public investment, the league awarded its 2 new franchises to Charlotte and Jacksonville, not St. Louis. The decision stunned local officials and fans who had poured their hopes into the dream of the St. Louis Stallions. The disappointment was hard to ignore. Millions of dollars had been invested, promises had been made to the public, and for a moment it seemed like all that effort had been for nothing. Once again, St. Louis found itself on the sidelines, watching other cities celebrate the future it had worked so hard to build. Still, construction pressed in Ed forward. Owner the dome stood tall and complete. It had everything St. Louis had envisioned. The only thing missing was a team to call it home. The arrival of the Rams, 1995. In early 1995, St. Louis finally got the break it had been waiting for. After years of failed bids and frustration, the Los Angeles Rams announced plans to relocate to St. Louis. The move was led by team owner Georgia Frontiere, who was originally from St. Louis and wanted to bring football back to her hometown. At the time, the Rams were struggling in Los Angeles with low attendance, an aging stadium, and little support from the city. St. Louis, with its brand new dome and financial incentives, offered a fresh start. At first, the relocation wasn't guaranteed. NFL owners initially voted against it, saying the move violated league policies. But under pressure and facing legal threats, the league later reversed its decision. St. Louis had its team. Part of the agreement required that the new dome remain among the top 25% of all NFL stadiums in terms of amenities and quality. It was a promise meant to ensure the facility stayed modern for at least 20 years. On November 12, 1995, the Rams played their first home game inside the dome, defeating the Carolina Panthers 28-17. For fans, it was a defining moment. Professional football had returned to St. Louis. The stadium, originally called the Dome at America's Center, was soon renamed the Trans World Dome after Trans World Airlines purchased naming rights. The team's first few seasons were filled with excitement and record-breaking crowds. For the first time since 1988, the city had Sundays that mattered again. St. Louis had built the dream, and now the Rams had brought it to life. The cracks beneath the surface. For a while, everything seemed perfect. The Rams were winning, the dome was full, and St. Louis finally had the football identity it had fought so hard to regain. But behind the excitement, small problems were beginning to appear. The lease agreement that brought the Rams to St. Louis required that the stadium remain in the top 25% of all NFL venues through 2015. This meant that every few years, the dome had to be compared to other stadiums. If it fell behind, the city would have to make upgrades or risk losing the team. At first, this didn't seem like a problem. The dome was new and fans filled the seats every week. But by the early 2000s, newer and more advanced NFL stadiums were being built around the country. Facilities with retractable roofs, luxury suites, and massive video screens. Compared to those, the St. Louis Dome started to look dated. Complaints grew about narrow concourses, limited parking, and poor sightlines for fans. Visiting teams described it as dark and cramped. By 2005, the dome was no longer considered top tier. Still, the city tried to keep up. In 2009, a $30 million renovation was completed. INT added them NetherU LED scoreboards, improved premium seating areas, and redesigned club spaces like the Bud Light Zone and Clarkson Jewelers Club. The Rams locker room was expanded, and the turf system was upgraded to a newer AstroTurf design. These changes helped for a while, but they weren't enough. Even after the updates, the dome couldn't match the technology or fan experience of newer stadiums like those in Dallas, Indianapolis, or Arizona. By 2010, both the Rams and the NFL considered the St. Louis Dome among the least impressive stadiums in the league. What started as a symbol of pride was slowly becoming a reminder of how quickly progress can leave a city behind. The lease that doomed St. Louis. By 2010, the deal that once brought football back to St. Louis had turned into the city's biggest problem. The Rams' lease agreement with the Dome required the stadium to stay among the top 25% of NFL venues. Every 10 years, it was reviewed to make sure it still met that standard. If it didn't, the team had the right to terminate the lease or switch to a year-to-year agreement without penalty. When the first major review came due, the results were clear. The St. Louis Dome was no longer close to being one of the league's best. City officials quickly tried to respond. In 2012, the St. Louis Convention and Visitors Commission proposed $48 million in renovations. The plan included upgraded seating, better lighting, and new concourses. But it wasn't enough. The Rams rejected it, saying the improvements wouldn't make the stadium competitive. A few months later, the city tried again with a more ambitious $124 million proposal that included a new 3-story glass entrance and additional suites. The Rams turned that down too. Instead, the team submitted its own vision, a $700 million reconstruction plan that included a sliding roof, modern video boards, and expanded luxury areas. It was far beyond what the city could afford. The dispute went to arbitration in 2013, where independent judges reviewed both sides. Their decision favored the Rams. The arbitrators ruled that the only way to meet the top-tier requirement was to follow the team's $700 million proposal. For St. Louis, that verdict was devastating. It meant that if the city didn't commit to massive upgrades, the Rams could legally walk away from the lease after 2015. The clock had started ticking, and everyone knew it. The dome that once brought football back to St. Louis was now giving the team a way to leave again. The return to Los Angeles. By 2014, it was clear the Rams were planning to leave. Team owner Stan Kroenke bought land in Inglewood, California, the first real sign of a move. In 2015, he confirmed plans to build a new 80,000-seat stadium there, what would later become SoFi Stadium. St. Louis officials rushed to create their own $1 billion proposal for a new riverfront stadium, but it came too late. The Inglewood City Council quickly approved Kroenke's project, and construction began the same year. The Rams' final home game in St. Louis was on December 17, 2015, a 31-23 win over Tampa Bay. Just weeks later, on January 4, 2016, the team officially announced its return to Los Angeles. The decision ended more than 2 decades of NFL football in St. Louis. Edward Jones ended its sponsorship, and the Dome's name reverted to the Dome at America's Center. St. Louis had built a dream and then watched it leave for the coast. The fallout. After the Rams' departure, St. Louis didn't let the matter end quietly. In 2017, city, county, and regional officials filed a lawsuit against the NFL and Stan Kroenke, accusing them of breaking relocation rules and misleading the public about their intentions to stay. The case dragged on for years as courts repeatedly ruled in St. Louis's favor, forcing the league to release financial records and blocking attempts to move the trial out of Missouri. Finally, in November 2021, the NFL agreed to a $790 million settlement. It was one of the largest payouts in sports history. The money was divided among the city, county, and the St. Louis Regional Sports Authority, though none of it would bring the Rams back. The comeback. 2 years after losing the Rams, professional football returned to St. Louis, just not through the NFL. In 2018, the newly revived XFL announced that St. Louis would be home to one of its teams, the St. Louis Battlehawks. For a city still healing from the loss of its NFL franchise, the news brought excitement and pride. When the Battlehawks played their first home game in 2020, nearly 30,000 fans filled the dome. The energy was electric, and the crowd made it clear that St. Louis was still a football town. The team's agreement with the Convention and Visitors Commission included a modest financial deal, $300,000 up front and $100,000 per game, but the emotional return was worth far more. Even after the XFL briefly shut down during the pandemic, fan support never faded. When the league relaunched in 2023, the Battlehawks home opener drew more than 38,000 fans, setting an XFL attendance record. The Dome at America's Center still stands, not as an NFL home, but as a reminder of St. Louis's resilience. The team may have left, but the city never gave up.